Well, thank you for being here. My name is Sarah Gelfand. I'm a managing director at Bluemark, and I'm really delighted to be moderating our session today on making sense of sustainable investing, where Lance, Andrea, and Kempe and I are going to talk about a report that Bluemark and Morgan Lewis just released that will allow us to opine on key market frameworks for sustainable investing, both voluntary and regulatory, their areas of overlap, and some suggestions for how investors can follow a few steps to comply and align with evolving market expectations. Before we get started, I want to introduce our panelists. Lance Dial is a partner at Morgan Lewis. He's the co-author of the paper, and Lance has held a number of in-house counsel roles at various investment firms and has worked extensively on ESG and sustainability issues. Andrea Weil is a managing director at Wellington Management. She's their director of sustainable investment policies. Core to her work is navigating sustainability issues globally and advising and developing the firm's policies accordingly. Andrea has held a number of leadership roles at Wellington since she joined the firm in 2008, and she also has held various roles at Harvard Management Company, McKinsey, and Morgan Stanley, among others. Kempe is an executive director at LGT Capital Partners. He's responsible for their ESG and sustainability work in their private markets portfolios. He's also a member of the firm's ESG committee, and he's been a portfolio manager in the sustainable investing world for a while, previously at Robeco Sam, Zurich, and had previously worked in investment banking. So a really wonderful and expert group of panelists here, and thanks to all of you for being with us. Just to sort of lay out the plan for the next 55 minutes, Lance and I are going to start by sharing some observations about current and developing frameworks that are sort of shaping expectations and requirements for sustainable investors. And we'll walk through a 4-step process that we laid out in our recent report that provides a structure for navigating these standards. We'll then open up the floor to a broader discussion with Andrea and Kempe so we can hear their perspectives as practitioners having to daily figure out how to make their organizations work in the face of these market dynamics. And then we'll reserve the last 15 minutes for Q&A. You can enter your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the panel here in Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Finally, we're going to record the event and we'll make the recording available afterwards. So to get started, the premise for this paper that Lance and I and others have been working on for several months was a recognition that the pace of new and changing market expectations for sustainable investors can feel really overwhelming. It's hard for managers to know what standards or regulations to prioritize, what steps to take to comply. And so when we decided to collaborate, we had the idea that lifting up areas of overlap across these frameworks could offer some clarity to the market in terms of how to practically approach this work. And while we weren't exhaustive in our analysis, we did look at a number of key standards that have relevance for managers, regardless of whether they practice ESG integration, thematic investing, impact investing, or really any strategy focused on both financial and sustainability goals. And as is common, regulators are approaching their guidance to the market, drawing from what's already been clarified in voluntary standards. So we have attempted to frame up where the guidance in the voluntary frameworks links to regulations to make it easier for investors to navigate. So to put a bit of a finer point on the pace and the rapid pace of changing standards in our market, I wanted to show a little bit of an excerpt from a deeper table in our report that highlights some of the recent efforts just in the sort of latter half of 2021. On the market side, and then I'll hand it over to Lance to talk about regulatory milestones. We've seen just enormous growth in the number of leading firms that have committed to net zero targets. The launch of the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, which brings together a lot of coalitions of net zero committers, is a huge milestone in terms of bringing together groups working on frameworks and tools for climate-related measurement and portfolio alignment measurement, and standards there are likely to come out next year. I guess another huge watershed event in our industry has been the IFRS Foundation, which houses the International Accounting Standards Boards, and their launch of the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board. They're tasked in planning to develop a set of sustainability disclosure standards that are, really a first in our market. And also, I think, quite important in terms of the broader industry's movement towards harmonization and coalescing around standards that Sustainability Board brings together will fold in SASB, the Integrated Reporting Initiative, and the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, making a few fewer acronyms in our market. And then just earlier this week, the Impact Task Force published a new report with recommendation for G7 finance ministers, really getting at it and making a call to action for greater transparency, harmonization, and integrity in reporting. And so all of this to say, in the voluntary space, we're seeing more harmonization, more drive towards transparency, and a greater and higher bar for disclosing commitments to impact. And yeah, Lance, maybe I can hand it to you to talk a little bit about similar developments on the regulatory front.
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. And first, before I start, I wanted to thank you and Bluemark for the opportunity to work with you on this paper and to be at this webinar. One of the things that's been very gratifying about this process is we're taking a seemingly very complicated area and trying to simplify it so that people can take actionable steps and work towards compliance and be a part of this movement. Just on this page, you see a ton of acronyms. I mean, this is a veritable alphabet soup of things that are going on, and it can be really intimidating. And so what I like about this, and what is part of my job, is to take these complicated things and help distill it. And I hope that this paper and this webinar goes a long way to help people understand what's going on, because it doesn't have to be hard. ESG can be ABC, it can be 1, 2, 3, and it can be lots of different things, whether it's SFDR, FCA, SEC, or any of the other veritable alphabet soup that we're dealing with. So with that said, I'm going to step back into a little bit more of the complicated stuff, and that's what's going on in the regulatory framework, because there is a lot. We have in Europe SFDR, and SFDR is a disclosure-oriented regulation that is meant to talk about how firms and asset managers can talk about their products, and when they can talk about them in a sustainable way, as sustainable characteristics or not. And there's, as Andrea will no doubt attest later, it's simple on the surface, but the implementation is exceedingly complicated. But underlying SFDR and underlying what I go to next in the SEC and what I go to in the FCA is a simple theory. And you're going to hear me say this a couple times. And I'll confess that I wish I was more marketing-y to come up with a better third word. But the idea behind all of this is to invest, test, and then disclose. It'd be nice if disclose rhymed with the first two, but you can't have everything. And that underlies our 4-step process. That underlies all of the regulatory stuff, and that also underlies a lot of what's happening in the market milestones as well. You want to invest, test your investment, and disclose. It'll go back and forth. And so you see that with the SEC. The SEC regulations right now, they don't have ESG specific regulations, but it's on their agenda. In fact, I was surprised to not see it on the most recent open meeting, which happened yesterday. But it is on their regulatory agenda as something to come out, and that regulatory agenda was issued on Friday, and they have a placeholder for it for April of 2022. And in RegFlex terms, what that means is sometime in the first quarter. So these regulations are imminent on issuer disclosures related to climate change, human capital, and disclosures to asset managers and funds about how they talk about their ESG related investments. So all of this stuff is coming, and the theory behind it is to do what you say and say what you do, to invest, then test, and then disclose, and make sure everything is on the same page. The FCA in the United Kingdom is doing something similar. They're looking for an alignment between portfolio holdings, investment strategy, and how you talk about those investment strategies. One of the initiatives that they've commented on in their paper recently requesting comment is that they've seen funds who have certain holdings that seem to go against what they're saying as far as their sustainability objectives. So they're looking for, how do we regulate this? How do we make sure that everyone is saying what they're doing what they're saying, that they're investing, they're testing their investments, and they're disclosing in a very common, consistent way. And so the regulatory pace of change is going to continue. And we focus here on EU, UK, and SEC in the United States, but this is going on globally. Regulators in Asia, everywhere, are in Australia, are looking at ways to figure out how to ensure that investors are getting the information they need to make the right decisions for their own portfolio. And that requires asset managers to have more discipline and controls on what their disclosures look like from a sustainability perspective.
Thanks, Lance. Yeah, it's clear. I like invest, test, and disclose. It's clear that regulatory bodies and previously and alongside them, voluntary standard setters agree on the importance of consistency between labels and practices, and that there's more alignment in the way they think about that than not. And that the move to disclose and be transparent and accountable is part of what we need to expect as a field as we move into a new era of greater scrutiny and regulatory attention. I think now we should move to our 4-step roadmap, because while we talk about all this, this alignment, I think helping people figure out how to get started and their steps of applying their practices accordingly. Let's talk through the 4 steps.
Sure. So I'll take the lead on this. Anybody can jump in. So in our paper, we identify a 4-step roadmap for dealing with this alphabet soup, this complex area of ESG regulations. And we've got them there in front of you. Step 1 is to label or classify. 2 is practices. 3 is identifying financial regulations, and 4 is a verification. And I'll go through each of these in a little more detail, just to clear out the specifics. But as an inception matter, from what I see a lot of firms struggling with is a unwritten here step 0. And that is to have an ESG strategy. You want to have a coherent ESG strategy for your firm. You want to know what directions you want to take your firm in, what products work, what products won't work, what client bases you're focusing on, what your clients are demanding. These are all things that you sit back and think about. How do we want to address our opportunities? What opportunities do we have? What opportunities do we not have? What opportunities do we build? What opportunities do we pass on? And that is a core element that I see a lot of firms passing on. I recently had a discussion with a client who said, hey, we have a RFP response from a consultant, and they want us to talk about how ESG is integrated in our investment strategy. I said, that's great. What are you going to say? And they said, well, that's why we're talking to you. We don't do anything. And I said, oh, well, that's not going to work, because invest, test, disclose. You can't disclose without doing the investing. And so they didn't have a strategy of what they wanted to do. Now, we were able to dig a little deeper and find that they were incorporating ESG in certain ways, and we were able to figure out how they could describe that to an RFP response that made a lot of sense. But having that strategy is really helpful. The other part of that, and this gets into label and classification, is having a taxonomy of terms. One thing that I see firms have difficulty in is some of these terms are not, actually most of these firms are not defined officially. And so you'll find that when someone says sustainable, they mean one thing, and someone else says it, they mean something else. And when they have a conversation using that term, they may come away meaning different things. And that happens at all levels of an organization, from in portfolio management personnel all the way to clients, and all the way to ultimate fund investors too, if you're advising funds. So ensuring that within your firm you have an agreed upon taxonomy of terms, so that when you say sustainable, everybody knows what it means. And it can be anything. Well, it can't be anything. It can be anything related to sustainability. You can say, well, a fund is only going to be sustainable for our purposes if we have exclusions, or it's only going to be an impact if we evaluate the impact of the investments on certain social goods, or a portfolio management process is not going to be considered for our ESG platform unless it does X, Y, and Z. And so coming up with how you define these terms is a critical kind of, I'll call it a step 0.5 before we get to step 1. And now we're at step 1, clarifying and labeling your strategies. Look through your panoply of products and figure out which ones are ESG, which ones are impact, which ones are sustainable, and how they fit within your organization. And by doing that, you can now get to a product suite and a product offering that you can focus on, going back to your strategy. The next thing is, I'm going to bring back my old invest, test, and disclose. identifying the practices necessary to substantiate the execution of strategy. How do you know that the strategy is being executed as it's supposed to be? How do you know that this sustainable emerging markets fund is actually sustainable? What sort of characteristics are you looking for? Are you looking for making sure that they don't have any coal power plant funded projects, for example? Are you looking for ensuring they have restrictions against cluster munitions or other sorts of social good or goals? So identifying those practices is critical. The good news on this is that it should be easy. It's complicated, but it should be easy because this is not different really in kind than what asset managers are doing with all sorts of other products. So let's say you have a emerging markets growth fund. There should be a process to ensure that the investments in the funds are following along its investment trajectory, that they're investing in a growth strategy. So that infrastructure, the way that a firm looks at their existing strategies, can be put on their ESG strategies to ensure that if someone says it's a sustainable fund, they're investing in a sustainable way. So there are processes that exist that can be utilized here. And so identify those practices and processes to ensure that you can do it. And then also look at your compliance, which is a nice segue into step 3, identifying financial regulations. There are things that you'll have to do, and there are things that you won't be able to do as you move forward through offering sustainable products. And that's going to be dictated by a lot of the financial regulations that are there. SFDR is a very complicated one, and it's about to get more complicated when they release the technical standards. And there will be very prescriptive requirements as to how you have to behave in order for your fund to be marketed as what we'll call Article 8 fund, which is one that is marketed on the basis of its sustainable characteristics, or an Article 9 fund, which is a fund that has a sustainable investment objective. Those are straight out as SFDR. But there are requirements attached to each. So you need to identify those. And so that's going to take some work. Based on your strategy and based on your products that you've identified, you can now focus the lens of what relevant financial regulations you need to assess. And then once you look at those financial regulations, the next step is to ensure you've got a compliance process for those. So if the financial regulation is don't talk about sustainability unless you've done the following 3 things or unless you have the following this, then one of your compliance programs would be, let's make sure we review our advertising and marketing materials and our disclosure to ensure we don't talk about those things for those products we've classified in step 2 as not meeting that standard. So identifying those financial regulations is also critical to making sure you don't run afoul of them, which no one wants to do. So that's steps 1 through 3. Step 4 is a recognition of some of the uncertainty in the market, going again back to kind of step 0.5, where there aren't defined terms. And so this is where it may be helpful for firms who've done their steps 1 through 3 and want to further validate their own compliance and further validate it for their own clients to get some help. And for this, I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Thanks, Lance. And just to build on what you said, I mean, verification plays an important role in response to the broader calls for increased integrity and accountability. But it's also an important opportunity for learning and sort of sense making and double checking that you have gone through steps 1 through 3 in the way that makes sense and is most appropriate given how dynamic the market is right now and its expectations. So, third-party verification or independent assurance of practices and classification can be incredibly helpful for firms as they navigate this space and want to make sure they're meeting the bar for what's expected from their investors and other stakeholders. As we were working on this, we sort of appreciate that these are high-level steps and that the specific labels, practices, and verification requirements will vary depending on a manager's goals. But we hope they outline like a universal sort of sequencing that makes sense as managers work to stay at pace with the market's dynamism. So with that, I think we should hear from our great panelists who are doing this work every day. And Andrea, I'm going to start with you and just ask you to share a little bit about which of the newer standards or regulations have been most influential in Wellington's work in shaping your approach to sustainable investing.
Well, thanks so much, Sarah, and thanks, Lance, for inviting me to participate and to chat with all of you today. I think those of us who are living and breathing this tidal wave of new ESG regulation and an accompanying tidal wave of new client expectations and demands, are always looking for opportunities to hear how other people are approaching these items, because the reality is that, I think as Lance articulated well, the regulators actually do not provide you with a taxonomy of what these terms mean. And so much of the hard work is actually trying to figure out what those terms mean to your investment processes, and then checking to make sure that you thought that at least you thought about the terms logically, and that you have an ability to test those, as well as then to think about and how you can report them. But then also to look at all of your market peers and say, how have they interpreted all of these terms? So I guess it's hard to say anything other than SFDR as being the defining regulation, because quite frankly, they were first. And so I do think that they have set a standard out there. It's not a perfect standard by any stretch of the imagination, but it's pretty telling when you look at Hong Kong's regulation and they're like, well, if you disclose alongside SFDR, you're good. Or in our conversations with regards to SDR, the UK's regulation, they're pretty clear that on elements like environmental taxonomy, that they're going to do their level best to align with the EU taxonomy. So I do think that they've been kind of driving the car, and other regulators are looking at what they're doing. I think they're identifying where there may be flaws or challenges and trying to improve on it, which is good. But it does lead to a fair amount of new regulation all coming at us in rapid fire. And so I guess the other thing that I would say with regards to standards was when we first started really trying to think about what is all of this regulation? What is the aim? Why are all of these governments all of a sudden dropping, hundreds of pages of new regulation on asset managers and asset owners and companies? And it's pretty clear if you read the 2015 Paris Agreement, that they all went, all of these governments went to Paris and they made all of these bold commitments, and they agreed that they were going to go back home to their countries, and every single one of them was going to write up a nationally determined commitment of how they were going to achieve their net zero by 2050 commitments, and do it in a just way, right? So bringing in that social piece as well, and really drawing upon things like UN SDGs or other previous regulation. It is an alphabet soup. But all of those individuals went back to their countries and they said, well, we don't have the tax and spend power that actually is going to raise enough capital so that we can, fund everything that needs to be funded in order to meet our 2050 commitments that we're about to enshrine in an NDC. We need the capital markets to fund this. And so we're going to seek to raise the bar and push transparency and shift the capital markets to incent funding these. And so one of my favorite phrases is, what gets measured gets done. I think the Europeans have embraced that concept fully. And as a result, they're asking us to measure and report on a lot of stuff. And that's, I think, how they're attempting to move the financial markets. If all of a sudden you have a fund and it's really clear that carbon emissions because we have to report on a trailing 5-year basis, are staying flat or going up in that portfolio, your clients are going to say, hey, this is a huge risk to the global environment, and you're not managing this risk. We're not going to invest in your fund. So by making all of that data super transparent and easy to understand, or I'm assuming it'll be easy to understand, we're getting there. I think that that's the point of all this regulation, and that's the mindset we have to have. So for better or for worse, the Europeans are in the lead. They've written a lot of words on lots of paper. My husband often laughs at me when I print out the paper. He's like, "Don't you work in ESG? Don't you work in sustainable investments?" But I'm old school. And then obviously the Paris Agreement. I mean, that really is what kickstarted all of this. And it just took them a few years to write all the regulations. And here we are.
Well, that's super helpful and noted what a sort of first mover role the EU has played in kind of setting the bar for other regulatory regimes. Kempe, you're sitting in Europe. I want to ask you the same question. And yeah, in addition to opining on the regulatory standards that have been most influential, and given your work, both on the sort of ESG and impact domains, what are some of the other frameworks that you think have shaped your approach?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And also from my end, good evening or good morning or good afternoon, and happy to participate in this call, and looking forward also to all the interesting questions from the audience. So maybe to add to what Andrea was saying, I think what is, and what both you and Lance have been saying in the introduction about your report is, what's clear is that there's this alphabet soup, or there's a lot of voluntary standards, and there's now more and more regulations. And these regulations are, we saw this coming for many years, actually, right? If we're honest to ourselves, I mean, we're all very happy that sustainability and ESG is mainstream. And with that, we clearly can expect much more scrutiny and much more attention to something that is mainstream. And what the EU has done is taken this approach from not regulating individual sectors or industries, but actually the core philosophy of going after the financial sector is saying money makes the world go round, and therefore it makes sense to actually regulate through the financial sector what is sustainable and how sustainable capital flows could or should be increased. And on the one hand, we welcome it very much. I think it's a very exciting piece of regulation, but it's indeed, like Andrea was saying, it's quite complicated. And the unfortunate thing is it's actually not finished, right? It's sort of halfway. So it's quite difficult to actually understand what you're supposed to do. Deadlines keep on moving, but that's probably minor detail. But really this taxonomy is of course, what is sustainable according to the EU is difficult. You can anticipate quite a bit, but these 6 famous points that they only gave clarity about climate mitigation and climate adaptation, there are still 4 to come, and then the whole social taxonomy is also still to come. So you do probably automatically need to work with other frameworks to actually fill in also for yourself as an investor, what is sustainable, what is usable in this context. And I think Andrea was talking about the Paris Agreement and the SDGs. I think the SDGs are in a way quite useful, because it was also the first time that there was a comprehensive framework. Also, not a surprise in 2015, and of course they're the follow-up of the Millennial Goals, but quite a comprehensive framework that gave us a bit of a guiding a compass to sort out what good looks like, right, in terms of outcomes. And I think that is probably also, and Sarah, you can talk about that much better than I do, but sort of ESG is relatively well developed. Impact is, there's a lot of attention, and a lot of things are in development. But these frameworks of, and again, with SDGs, you also need to be very careful not to start using all these fancy colors, and we really need to go deep of what indeed you are intending to do. Bringing it up a little bit again, and not making my answer too long-winded and complicated, I think it goes back to this invest, test, disclose that Lance was talking about. Is all these pieces of regulations are putting in place because of this mainstreaming, but also because of the need of transparency, right? The end investor, but also us as investor or the investment community, just need to have a common language, common understanding what it is that we're talking about, what it is we're working towards and then we should be able to disclose and report that. And we're probably going to talk about some of the challenges there, but that's ultimately, I think, a very good goal and a very interesting thing that has been set in motion with a lot of these regulations.
I'll just jump in there to not only thank you for the plug on the Invest, Test, Disclose, but also to note that a lot of this is unfinished and a lot of this is being worked through. But the North Star of all of this is ensuring that you're saying what you're doing and doing what you're saying. That the investor who purchases your investment product knows what you're going to do and that you're actually doing that. So, you know, Kempe brought to mind in my head the thing from Jurassic Park where there were holes in the dinosaur DNA, so they filled it in with amphibian DNA, and then, you know, all things happen. But you can do that here a little bit. There's holes in SFDR that you can fill in with SDGs. There's holes in all these statutes that you can put together. And when you start to really think about that, you start to see a picture of, you know, make sure that when you talk about sustainability, you're really doing the sustainability. And if you are following that as your North Star, you can fill in a lot of these gaps. And as we mentioned in the paper, you will be well prepared for the next iteration of regulations. As they clarify it, you'll be ahead of the game because their goal is to make sure that everybody's on the same page, speaking the same language, and everyone understands what everybody else is doing. And we'll eventually get there. So if you're thinking that through in your strategic planning, that's how you get ahead of the game.
That's great. I love the Jurassic Park analogy. Kempe, you alluded to it a minute ago. I want to talk a bit about challenges, and I think the audience may be hungry for some more concrete or tangible examples. Can you talk a little bit about some of the, you know, hurdles you've had to overcome internally to try to put some of these practices in place to feel like to put together these disclosures and what's helped?
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. And obviously we're moving now to the data topic as well, right? It's okay, you can only disclose and manage what you measure, and what you measure, you actually need to have data in order to actually test and measure something. This is the area where it's you quite quickly get also into, at least from our perspective as an asset manager and an investor, is you get relatively quickly into the different asset classes, because the liquid markets and the listed markets have much more data available, or at least the ESG data providers are much more developed in that space, and therefore have also been relatively quickly on expanding what they were already tracking and reporting on into what, for instance, in the EU regulation, there's this concept of principal adverse impact indicators. Basically, most of them were already monitored by the ESG data providers. A few are a bit more detailed, sort of percentage of renewable energy used and some other topics. But that's really where the rubber hits the road. You really need to get going, right? You need to start getting the data, and you need to start, if you're relatively advanced on your ESG journey, you probably have your systems in place, and it's relatively easy to filter out what you're looking for, or to add some data points. Where it becomes a bit more challenging, and that's the compliance function, or that Lance was also talking about, is bringing it back to your standard reporting. And of course, depending on the size of your firm, we're all running these machines, and some of these machines are quite complicated, right? So bringing it in across the different departmental functions, and then also into reporting, that's where, again, there's quite a bit of time spent and quite a bit of work that goes into it to fully prepare that. But I guess what I'm trying to say is it's not impossible, but you actually need to put in the hard work to also get there. What is a bit of a challenge, and also at our firm, we're quite a sizable investor in alternatives, is if you start talking and thinking about private markets, right? And then in particular, well, basically all private market asset classes, but also in private equity, that's not an asset class which is historically known for the best transparency or data availability. And then you get into also different initiatives or different topics. There's a ESG data convergence project going on within the private equity industry that is also trying to get started on just making available more standard KPIs, which align. They're starting with 6. They align with the 14 principal adverse impact indicators. But the challenge is really the data, managing the data and reporting the data. That is really where it's where the work needs to be put in.
Oh, thanks for that, Kempe. And your comments just now focus a lot on the challenges of ESG data. And I think many of us who also are thinking about tracking data that's impact in nature see the same challenge at that level as well. Andrea, I'd love to hear your challenges in data, but also given that you spend a lot of time writing policies at the firm, I would be curious how that sort of you think about the challenge of building the practices too.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about both of those topics. So, I mean, this is first and foremost a data challenge, as both Kempe and Lance have identified. And the way in which we're trying to tackle that at Wellington is, I guess I would say, threefold. So on the impact side, we've actually started to build out our own impact measurement performance team that are developing the processes for assessing impact and making sure that we've got structure and repeatability and objectivity in the build out of how we're measuring our impact portfolios. So we're really fortunate to have Oya Naduya join us earlier this year, and she's leading that practice effort out of our London office and in the process of hiring folks. So to continue to build out that team, because it is pretty important to us and pretty important to the effort. Obviously, we're partnering with our ESG data providers and probably will be expanding the amount of data we'll be bringing in to the firm continuously. And what's really important there is to make sure that the data that you're bringing in, that you've got good control systems so that you have a data governance process around it and have confidence in the data, and that the data that the portfolio managers are seeing is the same data that we're reporting out to clients. And while that might sound really obvious, it's not always as obvious. Different people have different preferences of vendor data, but given the fact that this regulation really is so reliant on data and data compliance, having robust data practices is incredibly essential. And in thinking through how that data winds its way through the entire organization, I really viewed this as an end-to-end operating model impact. And so you really need to think about every step of your organization and how it's impacted by this data. The third thing I would say is I think it calls on active managers to actually also think about how they create data. And what I mean by that is that there are areas, modern slavery, for example, where I've done a fair amount of work and been architect of our policy there. And that really comes down to the fact that there isn't great data on modern slavery, but we do actually have a pretty robust understanding of what good practice looks like and what good remediation looks like, and what do responsible businesses do in order to manage and mitigate that risk. And so, we've developed a survey that we sent out to 2,600 companies in order to understand the level of their practice and policy, and we're marrying that with our ESG analyst views on risks associated by sub-industry, using some controversy data, as well as some NGO data specifically around which countries have higher risk, and kind of bringing that all together so that we can have a robust data set that is informed by research and by the insights of other organizations that we value and appreciate their work from afar. So that there are situations where we said, this is something that's really important to the team. We understand that it's quite frankly an illegal activity, but the only way we're going to actually solve this problem, because this problem has been recognized internationally since at least 1930, when the ILO passed their first core principle on this, that we need to be a little bit more creative if we want to solve some of these societal problems. And that links pretty closely to one of the SDGs, as well as to the PAIs and otherwise. So I think we need to think really hard about how we can build robust data that we think has integrity, and then continue to challenge ourselves on the expansion of that data. And we're doing that through our IMM practice and through our ESG practices. You asked me a second question, and now I've talked so much, I don't remember what it was.
Well, I want to lift up two of the things you said that really resonated. One is the fact that it is end to end, that you view this work as not kind of sitting separate and outside. And also this idea that for certain areas or priorities where the data doesn't exist, that the work of building the data and building the systems to capture it is sometimes, it falls internally. And that's, I think, maybe back to Lance's Jurassic Park metaphor, part of how we stitch it all together. I'll come back to you, Andrea, but Lance, I want to ask you a little bit about, the challenges you're seeing in your clients and what advice you're giving asset managers who are struggling on this compliance and alignment journey.
So we're giving a lot of advice on this. This is a hot area. I'll focus on three things that are somewhat relevant. One's broad and two more specific. The first is the inverse of the invest, test, disclose model. I mentioned the client early on in the conversation who wanted to say something in their RFP about their ESG practices. So you also want to make sure if you want to say something that you're able to test it and you invest that way. It works backwards and forwards. So if you see a market opportunity, thinking strategically, and you need to be able to make certain representations, then you should build those representations, build the foundation for making those representations. It works back and forward. But it also makes sure, as you're doing that, you also make sure you're talking the same language. There's a great example from experience about the term consider. And we had a client who had the following situation. An investor came in, was really looking at a strategy, and they said, well, tell us about your ESG. And the disclosure was the portfolio manager considers environmental factors in making investments. And the client said, that's great. That's what I want. I want this to be an environmentally friendly investment for me. Let's go through. When you went down to the test, they didn't really have a test on how to actually test this consideration. And so then you went to the investment side, you went to the PM, and the PM would say, well, I consider it, but if it's a good investment, I'm just going to ignore it. And that's not what the client was hearing when they heard we consider investments. But that's not a wrong way to interpret it. If you do consider it, maybe it just has to have a higher bar. It's like, oh man, I didn't know they were polluting everywhere, so I definitely don't want to invest in this. So it's really important for you to for everyone to be on the same page and define terms like consider. Consideration means you will reject an investment if it meets certain criteria. So think about that. And that's one broad comment about that kind of ties into this. The other two more specific comments are be careful with investment guidelines. They can be trickier than you think because of the data elements that Andrea and Kempe were talking about. If you have an investment guideline that says, I will not invest in companies engaged in modern slavery, you've got a lot of variables there. What does it mean to be engaged in? Primarily engaged in, somewhat engaged in, any tie to, and then what is modern slavery? Where are you going to get the data? Where are you going to find out who's engaged in it, who's not? And that iterative cycle goes through everything. I use modern slavery as an example, but it could be, investing in coal. Does that mean companies solely about investing in coal, or companies that are just funding their next coal plant, or companies that have existing coal plants and are slowly decommissioning them? What are you trying to accomplish? Make sure you're very clear about that on the investment side, so that your test can be correct, so that your disclosure can be correct. And then the other word to the wise is just be careful as you're adapting some of these existing strategies that you're in close contact and you are with any existing investors. As a general reminder, worldwide asset managers are generally considered fiduciaries, which means you need to put client interests first. And so to the extent you make any material changes to the strategies and money that they've already given you and entrusted to you to manage, you need to make sure that they're informed of those changes, either through amendments to your fund documents or discussions and potentially amendments to investment guidelines in a direct relationship. So those are kind of three areas where I see a lot of where I'm giving a lot of advice to our clients, among many areas of the alphabet soup that we're seeing.
Yeah, thanks, Lance. I think that point about sort of the ambiguities in language is really important. And in a lot of our verification work with clients, we focus on more precise and clear documentation so that there is consistent and shared understanding of what you and I both mean when we say a word, which is challenging in a space that leads with a lot of values and words that don't always share the same interpretation. Kempe, I'm going to ask you a little bit about advice you might have for others that are sort of perhaps starting on this journey. I'm looking at some of the questions that have already come in from the audience, and maybe advice for smaller managers. How can they keep a pace with regulations? What of the sort of voluntary frameworks maybe you could talk about as, I think, more of an Article 9 investor you found helpful? And any other advice you want to offer to, if you'd give yourself even 2 years ago?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think generally, I mean, so there are a lot of these discussions, right? And it's sometimes they're a bit more woolly than other times. I hope we are quite specific and relatively clear also with the examples that we're giving. But one very simple advice is to keep it simple, right? And I think your paper is also actually trying to provide clarity and at least giving an insight, just also from a very top down, what are the regulatory frameworks that are coming at us, what are the voluntary, and how do they look like just from the outset. But then from keeping it simple, that's a pretty easy statement to make. But I think also we spent initially, and that's maybe a bit of a European approach, or maybe also due to the fact that not everything was clear and still isn't clear, we spent quite a bit of time trying to interpret or trying to understand the regulations. And that's partially helpful just to get you going, but it's not necessarily if also for smaller organizations, probably the best use of your time, right? And therefore, I would always try to keep it pragmatic and also try to say in a practical way, okay, what does this mean? And what's not possible is to link everything with everything, right? And I think that is maybe partially the challenge. There's regulations that you just have to comply with. So we can talk about it for a long time, but at the end of the day, maybe deadlines are postponed, but at the end of the day, you just need to comply with it. The transparency that is the ultimate goal of many of these regulations can be provided by different frameworks or maybe voluntary standards. And I think that is where investors might still have a choice, or you might say, okay, I choose this one above the other because for my strategy is the more suitable. Again, I would bring in practicality there as well. But in impact, I think we've come a long way also with for instance, the thinking around the IMP and all those kind of things, and the Iris Plus database that can help you just to not waste a lot of time. Okay, what is the relevant indicator here that I'm going to focus on? So maybe again, a bit of a generic answer, but that's some of our lessons learned. We are still in the midst of it. We have a huge project working group at our firm with a lot of people involved. We and this isn't to land, but different law firms, you get also different answers. So also there you need to be working with a lawyer like Lance that gives you clear answers and clear advice, because otherwise you can lose quite a bit of time.
Well, thanks for that. There was a lot of good advice that was specific there, Kempe. And Andrea, I'm going to ask the same question of you. What advice would you give to folks listening who are, maybe don't have quite the same level of resources that a firm like Wellington has, but want to figure out how to stay on top of things and prioritize their time effectively?
Yep. So I think first and foremost, figure out where your target market is in terms of where your clients are located, and only worry about the regulations that are appropriate to your clients. In Wellington, we don't have that luxury because we operate in every market around the globe. But one easy way of prioritizing is to not wrap yourself up in trying to understand everything if you don't have to. So if you're a smaller firm, that would be my first bit of advice. My second bit of advice is embrace the ambiguity. You're not going to get all the answers you want even from the regulators, even once they finish writing all the rules. So if you're waiting to make determinations because you're waiting for the ESAs or the EU or the FRC that they're going to come and tell you exactly how to do it. They're not. So you should just start. You should start running, and you probably should have started running a year or two ago. But like, if you haven't started, the sprint is on. And I think Kempe made a really good point. Just be pragmatic about it. Know who you are and know how you invest. Figure out what data you can use in order to demonstrate how you invest, and then get on with it. I guess I'm also going to mimic Kempe's, but I can't underscore it enough. I love lawyers, but sometimes you're going to make more progress at the early days to not wait for, the lawyers aren't going to give you the answers as to how to define sustainable investments or an E or S binding characteristic or what good governance looks like. You just have to put a stake in the ground and say, this is what I think it means. The lawyers will tell you if it's going to pass the sniff test or not. But if you are waiting for the lawyers to define those terms for you, they won't be resonant to your investment process. And you'll have a harder time figuring out how to implement them. So I learned pretty early on, we wasted some time because we were waiting for the lawyers to give us a cheat sheet, and it was never forthcoming. And so we just went ahead and got in the room and hammered out our definitions on all the terms, and then asked for their input. I've seen that there's people keep asking what international accords or documents to read, and I can rattle off a list of those just quickly, the ones that I found the most helpful. So the 8 ILO core principles, they're the foundation of a lot of the labor stuff. The 2011 OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. If you're worried about how you're going to deal with principal adverse impacts, that's your guide. Obviously, the Paris Climate Accord, which I mentioned, the TCFD framework. Pretty much every regulator around the globe is referencing TCFD reporting as the primary way that you're doing your climate-related financial disclosures, and so you should be very familiar with that document. And the UN guiding principles for human rights. Actually, one more, the UN SDGs. I think that if you have those read, when you start to read the regulation, you start to go, oh, they pulled that principle from here, and oh, this is in this regulation because, it's highlighted here. So for me, having read all of those documents before I started reading all of the regulatory requirements really made it all kind of fall together for me.
And you read them all on paper, right?
I did. I printed them all out, but it was all recycled paper, 100%
That's good.
recycled.
That's good.
Yeah.
Well, I think you've given everybody holiday beach reading. I don't know, but that was really, a super useful list. And I think your point about, putting a stake in the ground in cases where there's ambiguity is important. And so much of this work is about knowing your intentions, being really clear about them, and making sure you're disciplined and consistent in your execution relative to them. But that's not for a regulator to define necessarily, but for you as the firm. I'm looking at another question that came in from the audience about the SEC. And Lance, just given your close to them, I'm curious how you think the SEC is considering their approach and how well they're going to try to coordinate with the SFDR, and apropos some of the comments Andrea made at the earlier part of the call.
The SEC really prides themselves on doing their own thing for the United States markets. And they worry about people thinking, oh, you just stole SFDR. We saw that recently with the mutual fund derivatives rule. They spent a long time trying to avoid copying UCITS regulations. And so they ultimately released something that doesn't at all copy UCITS regulations, even though it does the exact same thing. So I know the SEC is looking at SFDR. I was on a call with one of our trade organizations with SEC staff members talking about SFDR, what parts worked, what parts don't. So I think they are looking at that as at least an input into what they're doing. But I think we should expect the SEC to do something different, to do something on their own. What I expect, kind of knowing the threads of SEC regulations and some of the conversations, is that we will see initially some disclosure obligations on issuers on climate change and human capital. And then from there, we'll see SEC regulations for asset managers, primarily on the disclosure and naming side first. This is a guess. It's not based on any inside baseball, but that's where I think they're going to go, and then they'll hone from there. But that's kind of what I'm seeing. It's not going to be a total coordination, but they do understand the need to make sure that they are not incompatible with SFDR and other global regulators.
Super. Well, I know we're running up against time, and so I'm going to leave with, I want to ask you each one parting question. And I am curious to hear how you expect the market to evolve in terms of verification of disclosures, and that may be a bit of a shameless plug for Bluemark, but also any other kind of parting comments about where you think the market is going in terms of areas of expectations for asset managers. And Kempe, maybe I'll put it to you first.
Yeah, sorry, Sarah, my connection is breaking up.
Well, I'll come back to you. I'll ask Andrea. I just asked about where you think the market is heading in terms of expectations related to assurance and verification of disclosures, and any other comments you have about where you think the market is heading.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the reality is that the approach, because of the way in which the regulations have been drafted, there's a wide array of ways in which to comply or to, deem yourself Article 8 or Article 9. And so as a result, I could imagine that clients would really struggle with sifting through not only the various ways that portfolio managers are attempting to meet new standards around sustainability, but also, do they trust the data? Is the information that's being disclosed good, solid information? So I guess based on our own experiences of trying to build our own IMP practice within Wellington, I think that having good, reliable data is pretty essential in this market.
Thanks, Andrea. And Kempe, I don't know if your connection's back and you can comment before we wrap up.
Yeah, very, very briefly. I think, and there was also a question about benchmarks in the SFDR. I think so benchmarks might be helpful to, it's not necessarily a verification, but just to have literally a benchmark and to compare yourself with a broader market. And I think verification, or that's also a big question that is still outstanding, is how the regulators and the supervisory bodies will operate with the deadlines, with the whole regulations. The expectation is in Europe that there will be probably a bit of grace time to catch up and to just get started. And then with that, I think also verification and validation practices will be important to actually drive that adherence to those regulations as well.
Thanks, Kempe, and thanks all three of you for being here, for your incredibly insightful comments, and for making the time. And thanks to all the panel audience for joining and making time. I hope the report is something you download and read, and know that all of us are interested and available in continuing the conversation at Bluemark and Morgan Lewis. So thank you and take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.